Good evening and welcome to Citizens for Strong Oshkosh. Our conversation tonight is about Oshkosh Infrastructure 2020. And to start out, I'd like to say a little bit about Citizens for a Strong Oshkosh. We're an open, inclusive, and nonpartisan community-based organization. Many of the public issues and political discussions seem to be framed in an either-or model that highlights trade-offs and choices between limited options. Citizens for a Strong Oshkosh seeks to broaden this discussion to explore or consider more options and possibilities. So tonight, in understanding a little bit more about the infrastructure of Oshkosh and how those issues fit into the conversation, we've asked City Manager Mark Rohloff to talk about infrastructure in the future in the next, 4 years, 6 years.
Or maybe more.
Or more. So here we have Infrastructure 2020. Thanks for being here, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Paula. Well, thanks for having it so close to my office. I just had to walk out the door, and here I am. I appreciate the opportunity for Citizens for Strong Oshkosh to have us talk about this. When Kathy Propp originally approached me about this, one of the areas that we talked about with respect to infrastructure was kind of a focus on economic development. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I think anytime you talk about infrastructure, whether you're talking about 2020 or 2030 or 2040, you really have to take a long-term approach to infrastructure and what needs to get done in order to either attract businesses, help businesses grow, or just grow our community in general. That's probably something that is common regardless of how it is. But I will talk from an economic development angle for a good part of this evening to give you an idea of what issues are out there and why good infrastructure is important to the betterment of the community as well as for general economic development. The areas of infrastructure that the city's responsible for are really four utilities, and that's streets, water, sanitary sewer, and then stormwater. Each has a role in economic development in attracting and retaining businesses, and they're all different. It depends on the nature of the business. I would say that for economic development, they're really all important because most of these are minimum requirements. If you have a poor utility system, that's going to make it very difficult for you to attract businesses to your community. At the same time, if you're a resident looking to come here, that's infrastructure is very important. And we've done a lot over the last 5 years that I've been here to improve our infrastructure. And I do periodically still get emails from folks who maybe haven't lived here very long. They've recently moved or they're a student at the university and they say, Mark, do you realize your streets are really in bad shape? And I was like, you should have been here 5 years ago. These are great. But the reality is that to somebody new, we still have to think about the new perspective that people bring, because even though I'm really proud of the progress we've made over the last few years, we still have a great deal of progress to make before we can really unfurl a mission accomplished sign, and I don't think we're there yet, and I think the public recognizes that, but it's something that's important for economic development as well as just for the betterment of our community. One of the areas, when you're talking about from a business standpoint, what the needs are, everybody has, depending on their business, a different perspective on this. For example, when you're dealing with streets, for somebody in retail, access and proximity is extremely important. There was an article in Scene magazine recently about, sort of lamenting that the chain restaurants are there, but the chain restaurants are there for a reason, and they like having that proximity, being very close to, not just close, but also easy on, easy off. Fast food places aren't fast if you can't get in and out quickly. When you're talking about industrial, they're really more interested in access to major markets and major highways that can get them to their customers quicker. They don't necessarily need to have a very visible sign that says, Acme Widget Company. They just need to know that the customers for their company can get deliveries quicker, and if they're accessible, that's important to them. With water, it varies. It depends on the type of business you're talking about. So for an industrial food processor, and we have a lot of food processing in Wisconsin, because of the dairy industry, water is very important as part of the process. It's probably less so for example, non-food retail type of operations. The other one that's common to everybody, and that's common to residents as well as businesses, is fire flow. A lot of people don't necessarily look at that, but fire flow from a standpoint of fire insurance and things like that, fire flow is very important. We had some discussions over the last few months regarding staffing for our fire department, and staffing is an element of a fire rating for a business, which is very important. But 40% of that rating is based on fire flow. So if you don't have a decent fire flow, a good water system with lots of loops in the system that make it have redundancies in your service, you can have some difficulties. And right now, with all the cold weather we've had, with some frozen water mains, if you've got a partially frozen main, you know that if you have some redundancies in your system, you'll have a good, reliable fire flow. So fire flow is extremely important when you're talking about industry, but also for other areas. When you're talking about sewer, sanitary sewer, there's a lot of similarities to water, but industrial users, it really depends on the nature of the business. If an industrial user has more byproducts, and what I mean by that is anything that through the process generates some type of discharge that needs to get treated at the plant, they want to know that the treatment plant is capable of handling their byproduct. If it's a food processor, that's one type of thing. I've worked in a city that had a tannery in town. Huge implications for something like that. So it really depends on the nature of the work. If water's just used for cooling, the water treatment process isn't as important, but you'd be surprised, even a place that has water with a lot of minerals, if you don't properly clean it, you can really gum up the works in a factory if you don't have good, clean water. So those are all issues that are there. Restaurants, they want well-maintained sewers, grease traps, and as much as sometimes we're a little bit of a pest to restaurants, they also want to make sure that we're maintaining their competitor sewers as well. Then there's stormwater. Nobody wants flooding, but there are issues that are there. Large impervious areas, like parking areas, you have concerns about stormwater runoff. A bigger a parking lot, the more runoff you're going to have. But you were also concerned about requirements for detention. That's what businesses are concerned about. What water do we have to detain before it gets back out into the streams and waterways? And then nowadays, with stormwater quality, green space is a huge consideration. Green space is actually used to help filter the water before it gets into our stream. So those are all issues from a business standpoint. But there's also, the city has some concerns of their own. With streets, traffic concerns. Everybody wants to be at the intersection of 9th and 41, and when everybody wants to be there, and you have roundabouts and you have all those other issues, you have to make sure that you're managing the traffic properly. And then road conditions, and that really comes down to the quality of the infrastructure, the potholes, maintaining things. Excuse me, we have some wonderful industrial parks, but if the roads aren't in good condition, how are people even going to want to look at our industrial parks if the road to the industrial park isn't very good? Water, our investment for a heavy water user is lost if we lose that business. So maintaining a business for water purposes is very important. It's a lot of investment to serve a high water user. And when you lose somebody like that, we as residents end up having to pay for that excess capacity that business is now left. So it's very important to manage our water flow. And then also, again, with fire flow, you want to make sure that you have managed your water supply so that it doesn't conflict with heavy water demand. Summertime, everybody's watering their lawns, or filling pools, doing all sorts of things. And heavy demand can impact fire flow as well. With sewer, with us, I mentioned some of the concerns with byproducts from different industrial processes. There's a little BOD is a term that's used in the sewer industry. It's called biological oxygen demand. If you have a user with high BOD demand, you've got to do a lot to put oxygen back into the water before it gets out into the lake. because if you put water without a lot of oxygen out into the lake, you're going to have fish that aren't breathing, because fish breathe through the water, not through the air. So that's really important that we make sure that shock demands on the treatment system are addressed. So when we have a business in town that does some shock demands, we make sure that we understand what exactly they're putting into the system so that we can better manage that. If we know that there's a certain time of the month or certain time of the day that they've got a higher than normal demand for a BOD type of product, we make sure that we work with them on that. Grease in restaurants, that's a huge issue for us, because you've heard the term grease ball. Well, there's a real term for that. And if one of the things you see is it gets into an area and it can back up, even a grease ball from a restaurant can back up a residential area if it gets into the wrong place. So those are things that we're thinking of all the time when we're talking about infrastructure. And then stormwater, the runoff to the watershed that's already experiencing flooding. Our two largest watersheds in the city are Sawyer Creek, which of course runs over by Sawyer Creek near Sawyer and Highway 21, but that goes back to over 10,000 acres stretching out into the rural areas. So we have to take care of everything that goes west of Highway 41. We have to manage stormwater demand. Similarly, Campbell Creek is another part that goes down into our rest of our industrial park. We have to manage both Sawyer Creek and Campbell Creek. Those are huge areas, and as we're building developments along Highway 41, we have to consider the demand on Sawyer and Campbell Creek. And then we have about 120 other watersheds in town that we also have to manage. Certainly not as big as Sawyer or Campbell, but those are things we have to manage. Then we have the new areas that we're dealing with now have to do with what are called non-point pollution. That's really runoff from parking lots, runoff from streets. We have responsibilities. We have to pass that on and be responsible for that as well. And then there's also erosion control during construction. When they're building, you'll see what's called silt fences. Those are types of things that we have to monitor, because as dirt gets into the water, it doesn't just make the water look ugly, it does create a problem for the environment. So those are all the impacts of the environment and for our infrastructure that we have to take a look at when we're going through the infrastructure. We're fortunate that our industrial parks are pretty much what's used as called shovel ready. What shovel ready means is that they're ready to start construction today. We are actually doing other things to make our industrial parks also permit ready, so literally they can hire a contractor and begin work immediately. We want to make sure that we can help a business start up as soon as possible, so that if time is of the essence, we can accommodate them. And so those are some of the things we've done. And it's going to get a little repetitive, but in terms of, excuse me, I gotta go back a little bit. Streets. I won't go back to the slide, but for industrial users, the businesses want easy access, as I mentioned. They also want to make sure that they have allowable weight loads. You hear a lot of discussion going on regarding the Highway 41 corridor, which is going to be upgraded to interstate status in the next couple years. One of the downsides of an interstate status is there are federal regulations for that highway, which are actually they have lower weight limits than we have on our own state highways. That's a consideration, because if a business wants to come here and have trucks loading up as much as they can, if they have certain weight limits, that's going to be a problem for them. On the flip side, for us, the biggest damage caused to streets is from heavy truck traffic. So we have to balance that out. We want to make sure that we're accommodating those businesses, but we want to make sure that we're not selling ourselves down the road to have more infrastructure problems. We're very fortunate. Our industrial parks have covenants that are already built in that require curb and gutter, and the purpose of that is to give greater curb appeal. When we're showing off an industrial site in our industrial parks, they're not ditches, they're very much cleaner. They do have that curb appeal that is attractive to a lot of people. That's not popular amongst every user, and I'll have people say, well, Mark, I can go to Omro and their industrial park doesn't have this, doesn't have that. We don't need those things. Well, it really is an issue of what type of theme you want to set in your industrial park. We're trying to attract a certain type of business, a certain investment in the buildings, and having the finished curb and gutter, we believe, has been very effective to attract a good standard for the business. We also, we work closely with Chamco, our industrial development corporation, and they, with the businesses, put covenants into those properties so that certain quality standards are met. So it's not just infrastructure, it's also how the entire business park, the industrial park, looks. But as I mentioned, conditions of streets are a concern. They're always a concern because a business looking to come to town isn't just looking to locate their business. They're bringing their spouse and they're bringing their families, and they want to know that everything is good. So they want to make sure that schools are good and streets are good. So it's not just about the streets in that industrial park that make sense, it's the whole package. And so streets, you have to think about that beyond just the business or industrial user. It's the CEO's spouse who, as one of my members of my audience is smiling because we say it all the time. A lot of times a spouse makes a decision on where a business locates. Don't let anybody fool you. And if you don't have good infrastructure to sell your spouse that this is a great community, you're going to have a tough time. The last thing is about designated truck routes. They're helpful to keep traffic off of residential areas, but businesses do like getting in and off, on and off the freeway rather quickly. So that's a challenge for outside deliveries and pickups if they're not familiar with the area. With respect to water, it's not just an issue of making the water available for the current users. You really have to think about long-term what the users of the entire community are going to need in 10, 20 years. So it could be infrastructure 2020, but it is 2030 and 2040 that we have to think about. And it's amazing when you think about the cost of a water main and the volume it can hold. 30 years ago, it was not uncommon to have a 6-inch or an 8-inch water main. So, a 6 or 8-inch water main. But in reality, a 12-inch water main doesn't cost appreciably more, but it can carry 2 to 3 times the amount of water with just a couple extra inches on your water mains. It also helps for fire flow, and it also helps distribute it. So if you're trying to go to farther out in the community, you want the larger mains to get out there because eventually you want the larger mains to serve the areas of the city. A few years ago, we were in a hurry to get infrastructure down to a Plainview truck stop to get them into the city, and we undersized our mains. If we want to really expand along Washburn Street down the road, we're going to have to upsize those mains again. Though that's a lesson to be learned. You want to size your mains for future use. And fire flow is one, as I mentioned. I can't emphasize that enough, but it's also, if you don't have enough fire flow, that probably means you don't have enough domestic flow either. So you have to think about those things. You'll hear a term, oversizing mains. That's what you do. Even if the business that's there today only needs 6 inches because they aren't required to have sprinklers or anything like that, if down the road there are going to be a need for sprinklers, you need at least an 8-inch main to serve a sprinklered building. So all those things you got to factor in when you're going into it. So oversizing of mains is very important. You just can't think of what you're getting this year. You got to think about what you may get in 10, 20, even 30 years. With respect to sanitary sewer, again, you really need to anticipate future needs. But the other thing is gravity flow. There's that old saying about what rolls downhill. Well, that's my preference because you need gravity flow with sewers because gravity does a lot better work than lift stations or any type of force mains. We try to gravity flow as much as we can in the city to get to our treatment plants, but there are some instances where it's unavoidable, where because of the topography of the city, the sewer mains have to be a certain depth, but they also always have to be tilted towards the treatment plant. And if they're not tilted towards the treatment plant, then you have to get a sewer station to pump it up and get it to the next area. So it's really important to have that. We want to have a gravity flow as much possible. So planning future needs of the area is a priority. And when we're planning an area of the city, we literally have to think 20 and 30 years down the road. Otherwise, we're going to be building lift stations. And the other part of a lift station, what the sewer lift station does is it takes the sewage from a given area, pumps it up, and then gravity flows it again. Well, I think we probably learned this lesson more so in 2001 than even in 2008, but we had massive power failures. Now, a lot of the lift stations do have backup power, but when they lack backup power, we're running emergency generators out there, and meanwhile, the sewage is backing up. And where is it backing up? It's backing up into your basements and things like that. So we like to avoid using force mains and lift stations as much as possible because it's just more energy efficient and less chance for error on that. So we take a look at that a lot. And avoiding those costs is really big because maintenance is probably the biggest issue that we're talking about there. We want to avoid long runs of sewers without manholes or cleanouts because the cleanouts are areas where our public works crews go in and clean out an area and just move it along. If you have to maintain more, it's going to cost you more. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining these manholes. So you've got to put manholes every few hundred feet. A lot of people don't realize, well, why do you need a manhole? It's all about maintenance. That's all it is. For older buildings, this is something that we've learned as time has gone on in Oshkosh. For older buildings, a lot of our roof drains and our sump pits and other areas of what are called clear water are actually hooked up to our sanitary sewer system. And we don't need to clean rainwater. Rainwater is pretty clean when it gets down to earth. And when we were doing Main Street in 2010, we discovered a lot of the older buildings were still sending their roof drain water into our sanitary sewers, and there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth because we had to tell them you need to redirect that to our storm sewer system because we don't need to clean water. It's costly because we're sending water to a treatment plant that doesn't need to be cleaned, number one. Number two, it actually throws off our treatment process. Because when we're expecting a certain concentration of sewage and you get a bunch of clear water, you're throwing chemicals at something that doesn't need chemicals. So it's wasteful, and then you're pumping extra chemicals into the environment that aren't needed. And then lastly, when you have too much water in your sanitary sewer system, it causes backups. And I see one of my friends in the audience we've had a great deal of conversations. Water from what's called inflow and infiltration, clean water entering our sewer systems, backs up areas, and it backs up people's basements. And I will paraphrase this gentleman in the audience who said, when we do that, we're really using residents' basements to do our sewage treatment, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. So we have to be very cognizant of that as we move on. So those are some of the things with sanitary sewer. Then stormwater, when we're talking about industrial parks, one of the things I'm really proud of what we've done here, and I can't take credit for it, this has existed for years, but I think that was a vision that our Chamcor Industrial Development Corporation and the city had. The second bullet you see there is regional facilities. Our industrial parks are built with a certain standard of stormwater ponds in there already. So what makes it very valuable for an industry taking a look at Oshkosh is a big cost of development of site development costs is building a detention pond. If we can offer that in the price of the land that we're selling, and we only sell land in our industrial park for $28,000 an acre, and when that includes your stormwater detention, you are giving such an incredible value added to that business that it makes it very attractive for them. But the main reason that we have that is we want to avoid impervious surfaces, and as long as they keep their impervious area under about 70% of the entire site, and when you think about a big industrial site, a big roof, big parking lot, if they can keep it under 70%, the stormwater ponds that we build will take care of them. It's only when they exceed that 70% that we have to concern ourselves with some extra stormwater needs that they have to pay for themselves. But for the most part, we cover it within the price. So that's a very attractive feature. For the most part, our goal is to manage peak flow. And there are two different standards that are in use. The state has a standard that they only require us to manage a 1 and 2 year storm. Well, what that is that's that's any old type of rainstorm that you see pretty commonly. You'll hear a term of a 75 or 100-year storm, and we've had our share of those over the last 75 to 100 years. We've had our share of them over the last decade. That's a statistical number, but what it says is when you get 5 inches of rain in a certain amount of time, that's considered a 75-year storm. We had, in 2008, that was actually a 75-year storm. We weren't even able to handle that. And we are developing new, when we're doing things now, we're actually building to a 100-year storm standard. So that's the flood control standards that we have. They're higher, they're admittedly higher, but that's something that we need because we need to know that when a business is developing here, that they're not going to add to whatever issues we already have. The state standards are much lower on the flood control side. There was actually some legislation going around, and oddly enough, it had to do with frac sand mining, which has absolutely nothing to do with the city of Oshkosh, but it got weaved into the law that they were trying to change to address this frac sand mining issue. And you may have your own opinion on that. I totally respect that opinion, but don't drag Oshkosh into it. We have no frac sand. We have no sand. We have clay here. But they were really dragging this into it, and they were trying to say no local standard should apply. Well, that would mean that we would only be managing 1 or 2 year storm events here, and I can tell you we need to manage 75 and 100-year storms, so we were very vocal with our state legislators about that. And if you want to let them know that that's a bad idea, I feel free to pass that along as well. But that's, I actually have 2 slides on storm sewer, because storm sewer there's 2 sides to this, and this was something I think Kathy was most interested in when we were talking. Stormwater quality has become a growing issue. 40, 50 years ago, when the Clean Water Act was enacted, it was really intended to get communities to do sanitary sewer treatment. There was really nothing done with stormwater treatment. Stormwater was really flood prevention. But as time has gone on, we've recognized that the amount of stormwater pollution caused by what's known as non-point sources, and really that's runoff from roofs, runoffs from parking lots that don't have the opportunity to get filtered. They get into our waterways, and I know we like to think we have the best cars in the world and we don't have any problems with them, but that little sheer spot or sheen that you see on your driveway and see in your garage and you wonder where it came from you. And that, when you're at your parking lot at work and when you're driving down the street, that all builds up, and that is what causes a lot of the pollution. So the EPA has gone through some iterations where they are putting regulations on communities as time goes on. We are what's called a phase 2 community. So the Milwaukees of the world are more phase 1 communities, but communities down to as small as 10,000 people, or if you're in a metropolitan area, even 5,000 people, you're subject to these stormwater regulations that you not only do you have to comply with them, you have to document that you're complying with them. And so we have been under these rules for about 10 years now. We're very fortunate that in Northeast Wisconsin we have a good consortium, but we're under these rules. And some of the things that we talk about, you'll hear the term TSS, and up on the screen it's total suspended solids. That's a huge issue. What that is dirty water. That I can get real complicated and tell you what that means. It usually means parts per million, but it's pollution in the water, and it's particulate matter that causes damage to the environment, and it also silts up a lot and just it actually creates a stormwater quantity issue as well, because the more silt you build up, the less water gets sent through. But total suspended solids is a key issue. So they have new regulations that say a new development has to remove 80% of its total suspended solids, and that has to be documented. For existing developments, there's not a requirement on an individual business to do it unless they're expanding. That requirement actually is given to the city. So now we are required to remove 40% of existing total suspended solids. So you'll hear about and I'll simplify it, a stormwater retention pond versus detention. The retention ponds are generally those ponds that stay wet all the time. They don't dry out. You'll see a lot of holes in the ground in the city. Those are detention ponds, the dry ponds. Think D for dry for detention. That's the dry ponds. That's to take care of flood control. But the retention ponds, the idea is the water gets in there, and as it stays in there, the particulate matter flows out and drops to the bottom of the pond, and then you clean the pond every few years of these particulates and treat that separately. But the whole idea is to get rid of the suspended solids. Now, the state is actually, in the last couple of years, have actually eased the rules because they knew that a lot of cities, including Oshkosh, were not going to meet that 40% rule. That's something that, unfortunately, despite our best efforts, we haven't been able to get that. We're still working towards it, but we were under the rules that were actually going to be in place in 2014. Fortunately, we were able to get a waiver from that. We're still working on it. Meanwhile, even though the DNR has eased up on those regulations, the federal EPA has not. So even though we're not being pressured by the state to address those issues, there is still an expectation from the federal EPA that we get that done. So stormwater quality is a huge issue. Surrounding communities, such as Amer or Winneconne, aren't necessarily under these same regulations. There's some similarities, but we have reporting and verification requirements. They don't have those same requirements. So when somebody says, well, I don't have to do that in Amer and Winneconne, the answer is you're correct, you don't, but we do, but that's because we're considered a Phase 2 community. As I said, the standards don't vary a great deal, but because of our reporting requirements, that's an issue. After the 2008 storm, in addition to everybody recognizing that we had a flood control problem in Oshkosh, the EPA was keenly aware of the issues out here, and they're watching us very closely, and they want to make sure that we're continuing to make progress on stormwater and sanitary sewer cleaning. So they're keeping their eye on us a lot. As I said, the state has waived some of these requirements, but because the feds have a different acronym that's called TMDL, it's called Total Maximum Daily Load Requirements for Suspended Solids. There's a maximum amount that they're expecting us to clean out. So we're still under those regulations, even though the state's eased up on them. As you can see, the state and federal rules, because they're not completely aligned, we generally have to follow the higher standards. We just can't pick whichever one we want. You don't have that luxury. So we have those standards, and those are the types of things that we have to follow. In closing, before I want to open up to questions and give you plenty of time, but these are only utilities that are under the city's jurisdiction. But underground, underneath our streets, there's a whole slew of other utilities. There's water, or there's electrical utilities, there's natural gas utilities, there's cable TV, there are phone lines. There's all sorts of different lines that are competing for space. And planning is really necessary for them as well, because when we're redoing a street, we have to consider all of the utilities that are underground. And in Oshkosh a few years back, when we were redoing some sewer mains, a decision was made it'll be cheaper to put new sewer mains over here and leave the old ones over there. And now that we're digging up these sewers after 75 years, now we're getting rid of 2 sets of sewer mains, not just one. So planning ahead, thinking of the future, those are things that we really have to give some strong consideration to. And you have to coordinate with all the other utilities. And I suggested to Kathy that maybe another discussion for future really would have to do with high tech. How do we attract high tech industries? How do we get that electronic infrastructure that just because it's not under the city's jurisdiction doesn't mean it's not important for development in this community, economic development, and even environmentally, just making sure that if we're using less electricity, if we're using less gas and using more technology, we're benefiting everybody. So utilities have always been a huge component of a community's overall development. I hope this gives you an idea of what it means from both a business standpoint as well as a community standpoint in balancing out what's necessary on infrastructure to attract businesses and retain businesses in our community. So I'm not sure if you want to field questions from the audience, Paula, or...
Sure. If anybody in the audience has questions, you can step over to the podium and we can open it up.
We're going to have this on OCMS eventually, so if you want to be heard on TV, you got to go to the mic.
Hi, Mark. Tom Grogan. Could you just talk a little bit about the city's program for street improvement? in terms of the number of miles that are typically worked on, what process is used for selecting them, and then kind of an overall assessment of where we're at and where we're headed.
Sure. The city has a 5-year capital improvement program where we identify all those areas that I just mentioned, the streets, water, sewer, and storm sewer. And sometimes they're blended together because of the nature of the work. Generally, when we do a street, we try to take a look at the condition of all the underlying utilities, not just the condition of the street. And I've had a lot of complaints, especially over the last couple of years, that, well, that street's in okay condition. One of the features we've added to our capital improvement plan is identifying the age of the infrastructure. And we are literally replacing sanitary and storm sewers dating back to the 1880s. I didn't say 1980s, I said 1880s. So literally, we're talking about infrastructure that's 125 years old. That's a huge consideration. At the same time, we recognize that the most visible one are streets, and we've picked up the number of streets we've done in recent years. We were probably doing about 6 to 7 miles a year in 2011, 12, and 13. We've scaled a little back for 2014 because of the Central Garage project. We just need to get that done. If you take a look at an average age of a street and say you assign it a life of 30 years, we've got about 300 miles. That tells you should be doing about 10 miles a year. Now, the reality is that some of our concrete streets do very, very well. And some of those streets can last 40 and 50 years. And if they can, that's a great thing. Somebody told me, you want to talk about useless trivia, we've got really good limestone in the Oshkosh area, and the limestone helps our concrete last longer. That's why some of our streets have done better. That's no excuse for why we haven't done streets since the 1930s in some areas, but it certainly explains why some of the streets that were built in the 70s are actually still doing pretty well. But we also have to take a look at the underlying infrastructure. But ideally, I would like to see 6 to 7 miles done on average. We only got up to the 6 to 7 miles a year back in 2011. There were a couple spikes when there was a newfound interest, and let's get more streets done. I think County Executive Harris, when he was on the council, they had a come to religion meeting and said, we got to get more. And then it waned again, and I don't want it to wane again. We need to keep at least 6 to 7 miles a year. The year before I got here, we were doing a mile and a half a year. That's just not acceptable. That'll take you 150 years at a mile and a half a year to do 300 miles of streets. It is sometimes as simple as doing that type of math. But we try to share that between residential areas as well as some of the larger areas that get higher traffic and that. Our residential streets, if we do it right, they can last 40 to 50 years, and we're really proud of the concrete work that we have done here in Oshkosh. We're proud of that.
Mark Harris. Mark, will the federal rules eventually require the city to treat stormwater? And if so, how are you going to gather the water to a single treatment plant? What are some of the challenges there?
I don't think that we're going to see it in my lifetime. I can't say, I'm not as futurist enough to tell you that in 50 years that they're going to require that. What they're asking for is local, it's really a passive treatment. The ponds are very effective at getting water to them, and if they can hold it long enough, everything drops out and eventually cleans it out. I think some of it's going to have to do with dealing with cars. The other thing I didn't mention about cars, the easy thing is talking about the oil, but the heavy metals that exist on your brakes on your cars, every time you compress the brakes on your car, a little powder wears off of your wheels, and there's heavy metals in there. That's a challenge. I could see us maybe looking at different materials and methods of brakes for cars that would minimize that so that we wouldn't have to get to the treatment process. But we can't just ignore the fact that we're all, especially on a slippery day like today, we're hitting our brakes an awful lot, and that powder that wears off of your brake pads, there's a heavy metal there that where your brakes compress on the car. it's amazing what you're able to learn about stormwater when you become a city manager. And it's little things like that over time we become wiser about. And in 20 years, people are going to wonder, why weren't we thinking about that in 2014? That's because as time goes on, we become more knowledgeable about the impacts of our environment. So, when you say, why didn't our parents or grandparents think about this 20, 30 years ago? It wasn't even on their radar screen. So I hope that my children and grandchildren are equally kind to me, because they're going to become much more aware of things. Hopefully it won't come to treatment, but I wouldn't rule it out in my kids' lifetime.
Kathy Propp, let's talk about how we pay for these infrastructure needs. You've listed some really interesting and imperative infrastructure needs. Talk about how the city pays for it, and what's our projection in terms of being able to fund enough improvements in the next several years to meet the goals that you're talking about.
Okay. As far as new infrastructure goes, generally as new streets are built, that's usually built into the price, and the developers typically pay for that. They also pay for the initial infrastructure. With our industrial parks, the way it works is the city purchases some land when we develop a tax increment financing district, and the tax dollars that are paid by these new businesses over the life of the tax increment district pay off for those. So new development's pretty well taken care of. When we're replacing infrastructure, with respect to our sanitary and water utilities, you're already paying for that. Fortunately, the utilities are operated as a private business. So they're required to replace their infrastructure. They're required to fund depreciation and replacement. So when you're paying your water or sewer bill right now, you're paying for replacement of that. With respect to storm sewer, a lot of that's also the case. It's the new ponds, the flood control and the stormwater quality control. Those are things that are going to be paid out of your stormwater fees as well. And that's going to be the pricey part. And that's why the stormwater rates have gone up as much as they have in recent years. I was told that when the stormwater utility was first created, there was a recommended rate that was twice as much as what it originally was. But there weren't any projects on the horizon because there was a lot of work that needed to get done, and so we kept our price artificially low. Now we're getting to the point where we're getting comparable with some of our other communities, in some cases higher than some, but we're sort of in the middle of the road. So the stormwater fees will eventually be paying for those, but the rates have gone up. They went up 15% this past year, and I wish I could tell you that that's going to stop and end, but the reality is that we still have a long way to go on stormwater improvements, and that's going to continue. With respect to streets, a lot of communities do it different ways. Most cities do it similar to the way Oshkosh does it. We have a very simple approach. If you take the street and you divide the cost into threes, each side of the street pays for 1/3 of the cost, and the city pays for the last third, recognizing that everybody has a certain benefit. So the general tax dollars through borrowing pay for 1/3 of the road. The other 2/3 are paid by each side of the street. Now, anytime you do what's called an overbuild, and overbuilds are quite common, especially on some of our larger streets. When we did Ohio Street and Wisconsin Avenue, when those streets were done, we did overbuild. So you don't necessarily charge the entire amount to all the adjoining property owners. There is certain overbuild that the city pays for as well. But for the remainder of it, it's covered by special assessments. And what happens there is that the council holds a hearing where we send the resident an estimate of what it'll cost to do these public improvements, and we tell them all the costs that are associated with it. And they come to a public hearing, and generally they're not too happy about that because they thought their tax dollars paid for all this, and then every 30, 40, 50 years they get a notice from the city that it's time to replace their street, and they're pretty surprised. For the older areas of town, because they're smaller lots, generally that's only anywhere from 2 to 7,000, but for the bigger lots, 10, 15,000 is not unusual for every 30 to 50 years. That doesn't seem too much, but when it's hit to you and it's sent to you with a notice from the city, people get pretty upset. But special assessments are a pretty common funding vehicle for cities to fund at least a portion of their capital improvement plan. Did I cover everything, Kathy? Oh, good. Thanks.
I actually have a question along the same lines. A couple summers ago, a friend who actually works for the state DOT was here, and he noticed that we use all concrete on our streets. And his comment was, Oshkosh must have a lot of money that we're using concrete on all our streets. What's the reason for that?
We do, and I'm surprised the DOT, somebody from the DOT would say that. They must not be working in the construction section.
Not anymore.
But we do what's called a pavement life analysis. So we take a look at the life of a concrete street versus the life of an asphalt street. Sometimes that varies, but for the most part, concrete is proven to be a more reliable, longer-lasting product than asphalt. Generally, an asphalt street will last you 20 to 30 years. Concrete streets last 30 to 50 years. And in recent years, asphalt is mostly oil. And so you're paying, as the price of oil has gone up, the price of asphalt. In the last few years, it's almost break even. Concrete's still more expensive, but because the quality of the concrete is more durable. And then, as I said, the story I heard about the limestone, our really awesome limestone makes it even a better product for us. So even though it costs more in the short run, our pavement life analysis shows that we actually get a better product in the long run by doing concrete. Now, with that said, the university, when they were doing Sage Hall, they'd asked that their street get redone. And I know that based on the life of the utilities under there, that they were not going to, we didn't have time to do a concrete street and get all that done. And we said, well, we'll asphalt pavement. It'll last maybe 15 years based on the type of asphalt treatment we did. It'll last about 15 years. And then sadly, if you looked over at the university in front of Axle Tech this weekend, we had a water main break. Okay, some of the students are shaking their head. We had a water main break. So there's our first there she blows in there. And that's why we didn't do concrete. We knew that the condition of that infrastructure was not the greatest. We knew that in the next 10 to 15 years, we'll probably need to do not just the street itself, but the entire infrastructure. So we put a road in with an expected life of 10 to 15 years rather than a life of 50 years. And if that had broken over the weekend and we just put concrete in there, it would have been money poorly spent. So we sprung a leak, but we're okay. It was pretty nasty over there, wasn't it? Yeah, it was really bad.
Any other questions?
Oh, let's get another one. Kathy Prop. Tell us about water towers. Do we need a new water tower down here in central Oshkosh? And what might it look like? Is there a way we can make it nicer?
Yes and yes. Water towers are a part of the fire flow. You need system reliability. You need water located in strategic areas to maintain water pressure, not just fire flow. And so we were asked, do we really need to have an ugly water tower in the middle of the city? And the answer is, well, not necessarily, but given the options, the answer really is yes. You can put what are called booster stations to keep the pressure up in the system. But again, that's not much different than when we talked about with sanitary sewers. Then you're relying on something to constantly pump water 24 hours a day. With a water tower, you pump it up there once, and then Mother Nature gravity feeds it and keeps the system under pressure without electricity. If people stopped, if we had a power failure and people just held off using the water for a while, we wouldn't have much of a water problem if they just used it for absolutely necessary needs, because gravity would feed the system. If we had a pump station, electricity, we'd be out of pressure in this area of town. Our water treatment plant is over by Menominee Park, so it has to come straight across Merritt and Church Avenue. The biggest main in the city is right outside of City Hall. It is a 20-inch water main, and you heard me talk about 12 being really big. 20 is mondo big. And it's extremely important to distribute water to the whole city. And we don't have a water tower anywhere on the north side except right here, right outside my window, along Marion Road, and then the one on the north side. So we do need them strategically located. As far as aesthetics, beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. I had brought up to the council that a lot of people wanted to get rid of the ugly water tower, and I love all my council members equally, but one of my council members said, well, somebody said that they really like the nostalgic look to that, and I looked at the rest of the council and I go, there you go. It is, you can put in any type of water tower to satisfy your needs. Clearly, it's going to be a community decision. For myself, I look at that, and I know I'm dating myself. I think of the old TV show from the 60s, Petticoat Junction, and when I see our water tower out there, it is rather dated. It was built in the 1930s. 75 years is a good life for a water tower. It really does need to get replaced. There are other models that can be used that are a little sleeker, but because beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I think that's one of those ones where I will rely on the wisdom of my council members to tell me which one they like best. There are some, just like the pavement issue, there are different types of water towers that, depending on the bidding process, you can actually get a better deal on some. I did 2 water towers in my previous community. They were done completely differently because the price for that type of design or that type of model was different. They were 3 years apart. 3 years apart, the economics of one construction method changed from one to the other and made it more cost effective. So when money's an issue, there's options. When aesthetics are an issue, I don't know. We'll find out. But you can do it very cost effectively and meet aesthetic needs.
Mark, Tom Grogan again. Could you talk a little bit about the rail service and what the future looks like? You know, just give us a thumbnail sketch of developments that may be occurring.
Rail is a really fascinating topic that I've learned more about in my short time in Oshkosh than I did my entire 30 years in local government. There's a lot of dynamics going on in the rail industry these days. CN, Canadian National, just built a new bridge crossing the Fox River, and you would think that that would actually improve rail service to the city of Oshkosh. In fact, I would maintain that it's done quite the opposite. We had no control over that because that's not regulated by anybody at the local level and virtually nobody at the state level either. That is all based on laws that were written in the 1850s that are still in place today. In fact, I would submit to you that the installation of the bridge means the cars can go through town faster, so they can get from Canada to Chicago quicker. That's what those rails are designed to do. That's brought up some interesting dynamics because there are some smaller railroads that do try to do some local service, and it's actually caused a little bit of a controversy. If you live in the Allerton Drive area just west of Washburn Street, south of 9th, between 20th and 9th, the neighbors out there are pretty upset, and you can't blame them. The old railroad that went through Kittywampus through the city for all these years, dead-ended at Highway 41, and in recent years, the railroad has decided that loading Oshkosh Corporation trucks at that location was a good idea. It may be a good idea for the railroad, but the residents there are literally getting awakened in the middle of the night, and it's been very discourteous to the residents there. We did talk to Oshkosh Corporation about it. They're mandated that they have to select the most cost-efficient delivery method under their contract with the federal government, and the most cost-effective way is getting those on trains. With that said, I think it's in the teens percentage, 15% or so of their transports are done through rail. So it's not like they're sending all their trucks. 85% of their trucks are still getting hauled out of town on a truck. They're not getting hauled on a train, but it is more cost-effective. But it's literally they're getting loaded in people's backyards. So Oshkosh Corporation has been working with us to identify a location in our industrial park that is very well suited. In fact, one of our stormwater ponds, we identified some land between the railroad tracks and our pond that we could put what's called a siding, that they could load the trucks there right off of Oakwood, get them on and get them back on their merry way. But the railroad hasn't been the most cooperative on that. Oshkosh Corp is working with us potentially to get some state funding for that, and our county executive, Mark Harris, has told them that until they start cooperating and playing nice with Oshkosh, there's monies that counties have been submitting to keep those railroads going, to maintain them, and they don't want to use those funds to maintain and put a line in to help the area. So rails, it's fascinating. A business that wants rail service wants it because it is a very cost-effective way to deliver goods and but it's very disruptive to nearby residents, and so those are the types of things we're factoring in. Hope that answers your question.
Any other questions out there? Anything else you want to say, Ted?
I think you can see that infrastructure has a huge impact, and it is so key to being successful, not just in economic development, but in being an attractive city and being a safe city. There's health and safety issues that I touched upon, but they're weaved through all of these issues. When you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about basic health and safety, which is our primary responsibility. So it's not just good business; it just makes good sense as well. So appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, and hopefully I didn't bore you too much with too many acronyms of things that we have to regulate on a daily basis.
I think a lot of people are finding out the importance of infrastructure this winter and worrying about whether pipes are freezing and that kind of thing. So I think we all appreciate what the city and does for us all through what you've talked about tonight. And thank you for doing that for us.
Thank you.
And I think tonight's program reaches the vision that Citizens for a Strong Oshkosh has to make our residents more informed and involved in what our community has to offer and needs to have for our citizens. So thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.